Hi, this is Steve, and I want to welcome you to another Tech Leader Talk discussion. This interview is part of the Space Tech Innovation event, where space tech leaders are sharing their latest trends and key insights to grow any tech company. It's a free event. You can register at spacetechinnovation.com to see all the videos, edited transcripts, and an executive summary for each interview. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Laura Forczyk. She's the founder and executive director of Astralytical, which is a space consulting firm. Laura guides businesses and government entities to grow in the exciting and fast paced space sector. She's passionate about spaceflight and the entire space industry. And she's got broad experience spanning science, technology, exploration, and public policy, which gives her a very unique perspective on this entire industry. During our discussion, Laura talks about opportunities for non space companies to expand into the space industry. And she also provides information about many space related jobs that do not require a STEM degree. So I know you're going to get some good information from our discussion and hopefully some good insights about the space industry and how you might be able to play a role in that industry. So let's get to the discussion with Laura. Hi, Laura. Thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me on, Steve.
So I gave the audience a little background about you before we got started here. Tell us what's your journey, though, into the space world and the things you do today. Kind of how did that get started? Where did you find that passion for space?
I was one of those kids that loved space as a kid. I remember as far back as third grade writing a story about going to the moon and what I would bring and what I would do. And it
Wow.
must have been inspired by a book I read about Apollo, but I don't know because that part is lost to history. But I do still have that short story. And that must have stuck with me enough that I remember obsessing about the moon. My parents gave me a little telescope when I was a kid. And then they sent me to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama, when I was
Mhm.
in middle school.
Cool.
And I actually went 4 times as a kid. Twice in middle school, twice in high school, and then twice as a NASA intern later in
Wow.
life. So, yeah, my journey goes goes far back. I thought I was going to be a scientist working at NASA. So I started out doing astrophysics and I got my first degree in astrophysics, astronomy astrophysics, where I specialized in high energy astrophysics. So
Okay.
X rays and gamma rays that come from super energetic explosions from gamma ray bursts. And
Okay.
those are the most energetic explosions that we know of in the universe.
Hmm.
It's really cool stuff. We got data from space telescopes and I analyzed it. This was in undergrad when I got a NASA internship that then
Cool.
transitioned me to graduate school in Huntsville, Alabama, working at Marshall Space Flight Center.
Oh,
But
nice.
realizing that I don't like coding, I'm not a computer programmer. I wanted something different. I then transitioned to what I call experimental planetary science, where I
Hmm.
worked with my hands in a lab, majoring, getting my PhD in planetary science, which I never did finish that PhD, but I did get all the way to the dissertation part and working in a laboratory setting with engineers and scientists both. And we were trying to figure out how to mimic conditions on different planetary bodies, such as the moon, Mars, asteroids, anywhere where there is a dusty surface. And that
Okay.
dust we call regolith, that dirt and dust. And I wanted to figure out the dust dynamics. So, what happens if you touch down on the moon? And this is really relevant right now because we're landing all kinds of things on the moon.
Yeah.
And it started out with low energy impacts, but then I did a summer internship at Marshall Space, no, at Kennedy Space Center, and we did jet impacts, like retro rockets landing on the surface of the moon, for
Okay.
example. That was really cool. So I enjoyed
Yes.
that, but you can't be a grad student forever. And I managed to get myself a job before I even graduated, working at what is now called the ISS National Laboratory. It is the nonprofit side of NASA's research on the International Space Station, looking at how space station research can benefit life on Earth.
Hmm.
So we always hear about astronaut research or using space station as an analog for the moon and Mars, which is fantastic. But my work with ISS National Lab was to look at how do we use that environment, the microgravity environment, the radiation environment, even the cycling of the power system, if you're going from day to night, day to night, day to night, back and forth.
Okay.
How do you use that special environment of the ISS to benefit human beings on Earth, to benefit life on Earth? And so I was part of a tiny science team there, working with engineers, developers, anybody who had any kind of invention or thought as to how to
Okay.
use that environment on the ISS. And we both approved and helped facilitated their payloads to the ISS, as well as gave them funding for how they might initially kick off their research, and a free ride to space for the payload, not for people. And then from there, I actually got hooked up with a startup based out of Switzerland that was trying to do point-to-point suborbital transportation. So we know that it takes a long time, hours and hours and hours, to fly halfway around the world, or even to get from the United States to Europe. It can take many hours. But if we could go to space, suborbital space. So suborbital means that you don't go all the way around the Earth. You just go up into space and then come right back down.
Okay.
And that is called suborbit. And if you can go into the suborbital environment and come right back down, that's about 30 minutes to anywhere. It's a really, really
Wow.
quick hop anywhere around the world. So you've seen like Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin doing suborbital tourism hops, but they are down in the same place. So they launch from the same place and they land in the same place, or splash down. I don't know if splash down is the right term, but landing in the desert and
Yeah.
with parachutes. And the idea is that if you had spaceports around the world, and so the company I worked for, they were based in Europe. They wanted spaceports in North America, in Asia, in Africa. They wanted spaceports around the world where they could do these kinds of really fast transportation hops. And this is envisioned for both payloads and for people, where we can, in the future, revolutionize how we do transportation, cargo and passenger transportation around the world. But this company went bankrupt. And as these things go, right?
Yeah.
About that time is when I started my consulting company, Astralytical, which is now 7 years old, focused
Okay.
on how to help businesses, government entities, and nonprofits grow in the space sector, whether they already exist in the space sector or whether they are outside the space sector and are trying to expand into it.
Okay. Yep. And we'll be talking about that some on the call here. Um, y- so a lot of stuff going on. You and I have talked previously before this interview. And so years and years ago, when I was a kid, it was pretty much the Apollo system, and then Russia had their space system. But it's a lot different today. And it's a lot more, it's not just government, and it's not just a couple organizations. It's a lot of companies, and there's a lot of commercial activity. What excites you the most, and what's most interesting to you about this kind of space ecosystem that we're in today?
It might not surprise you that I'm a moon girl. I'm a lunatic. And so for
Good
me,
term.
the Artemis program is what excites me, because I was not alive for Apollo. And so the other thing about Apollo, it was very limited to certain group of people, where back then, NASA astronauts, they had to be coming from a test pilot, a military test pilot background.
Okay.
And back then, that was very limited. Women weren't allowed to be test pilots back then. So women were not allowed to be astronauts back then.
Hmm.
So it's a very small segment of the human population that landed on the moon back in the 1960s and 70s. And then we stopped going.
Yeah.
And we've not been back since 1972. So 50 years have gone by, and now NASA is returning, not just returning to do what we did with Apollo, but returning with a more diverse crew, returning with commercial partners and international partners. In fact, the next Artemis launch, which is Artemis 2, will have a Canadian on board. And
Okay.
Artemis 3, which is the first landing mission to land on the
Mhm.
surface of the moon, that one will have a woman on board. So we will
Cool.
finally see greater representation of the human population on the
Mhm.
surface of the moon. And that's just not it. It's not just symbolic, it's also for science. Coming as a planetary scientist, I know how valuable the moon is to the Earth Moon system, and understanding where we come from, understanding our solar system, understanding Earth history. And then, of course, we've got commercial involvement, which means that there are companies out there that are contracted to bring science payloads and
Mhm.
mining equipment and surveying equipment and all kinds of things that we can use for infrastructure, for using the resources already existent on the moon. I talked about the regoliths, using the regoliths, turning that into water, turning that into propellant, turning that into concrete kind of building materials so that we can have landing pads or sidewalks or buildings made out of the lunar regolith that's already there. So there's a lot,
Hmm.
even telescopes on the far side of the moon. It has been proposed. So there's really cool things that could be happening with the Artemis program in the near future.
Okay. So this is probably a dumb question to ask, but if you get the opportunity to go to the moon, how long would it take you to decide before you said yes?
A nanosecond.
Okay. Kind of what
Yeah,
I thought.
I'm available if anyone wants to send me to the moon.
So how obviously there'll be scientists going to the moon, but what do you envision? What have you heard? And kind of what do you envision if we do, I don't know if colonize is the right word, but start building communities on the surface of the moon? What kind of people are going there, and who could add the most value by visiting a place like that?
Right. So the exciting thing is that NASA will announce this year who that first Artemis 2 crew is. And Artemis
Okay.
2 is going to go around the moon. It's not going to
Hmm.
land. But
Okay.
it's the beginning, right? It's the people that we're going to send for the first time since 1972.
Yeah.
And not just NASA, right? I already mentioned that Canadian Space Agency is involved,
Hmm.
ESA, which is the European Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, they're all involved. There's something called the Artemis Accords, which is a series of multilateral agreements with 23 countries so far that
Okay.
are a way of normalizing how we behave in space and how we cooperate in space. And then there's on the other side of the world, there's China, which has its own lunar plans as well, partnering right now, it looks like with Russia, as well as some other countries. And so they
Okay.
have their own landing moon based concept where they are going to do a similar type of plan as NASA. But for right now, they are slightly more behind than NASA is. NASA has its Artemis Base Camp idea, but it's pretty vague right now. But it's
Okay.
not just governments. We actually already have two private circumlunar missions around, that's around the moon. So SpaceX is developing a very large launch vehicle, a super heavy launch vehicle called Starship. And
Hmm.
it's not operational yet. They've done some test prototype hops. And hopefully this year, we will see its first mission to go in orbit without people.
Yeah.
But NASA has contracted them for its Artemis program. So it is going to do government
Okay.
missions. Outside of government missions, it actually has two missions booked to take private individuals around the moon. And that's just
Hmm.
the start. You can imagine private individuals going to the surface and eventually landing. So you do
Yeah.
have the scientists, engineers. We sent one scientist back into the Apollo days. And so I can imagine we'll send many more scientists during the
Hmm.
Artemis days here coming up, but also private individuals who happen to be very wealthy or who happen to be very lucky because one of these missions actually is being paid for in full by a billionaire who has chosen, I think, 8 creatives, he's calling them, 8 people with platforms that have some kind of creative side to them, whether they are singers, YouTubers, producers of
Yeah.
movies, different people who have that kind of influence and audience who can spread the news of, we're going back to the moon, and not just we as in NASA, but we as in humanity is going back
Well,
to.
and they would have a very different perspective. They're not a scientist, they're not a mathematician or physicist or anything. They're creative. They're looking at it. They'll have a whole different view and come back with a very different story, a very different experience. So that's cool. I hadn't heard that they're doing that.
Yeah, it's called the Dear Moon Project.
Dear moon, cute. So you'd mentioned earlier that there are so many opportunities for existing companies to either transition to do space tech work, or maybe that expand their product line or their services. What are some examples of that, and what kind of companies could be thinking about this? There may be listeners in tech companies that never thought they would have any link to space, but it could be an exciting expansion to their company.
So I would argue that every tech company has some kind of link to space
Okay.
already, just don't know it yet.
Hmm.
And that's the same as most of humanity. Most of modern humanity actually uses space on a daily basis. They just don't realize how much it's ingrained into their daily lives. their daily commerce, all of that. And the way that companies can be more intentional in using space is to realize that they have certain skill sets, certain products, certain services that are going to be needed either with the direct space data or space operations or with downstream services. So the ways that we can use satellites for various reasons. For example, there's a proliferation of there's a proliferation of Earth observation satellites for various uses. Traditionally, it's been a lot of land surveying, mapping, environmental monitoring, the weather satellites that we use on a daily basis.
Yeah.
But more and more, it's being used for real estate, for insurance, for farming. It's heavily involved in agriculture, not just to figure out, where your fields are, but to program automated machines so that they can know exactly, based on GPS satellites, that's kind of signal, where to farm and where to plant. I mean, that stuff is integrated into modern society and people don't realize it's being used all the time around the world. So businesses can be intentional by using that kind of data to better their businesses, or they can expand into space in other ways. I had a client last year. It was an engineering firm that did 3D printing, and they wanted to expand into space. And based on working with me and figuring out who their competitors and who their potential users and customers were, they actually rebranded themselves. And now they are a space 3D printing company.
Nice.
And so that's the kind of thing that you can do to be very intentional about how you want to get involved in space. Not just NASA, mind you, they actually got a grant from the Department of Defense because the Department of Defense does a lot of space work. You might have heard of Space Force, but there are other entities within the DoD that also use space and have a lot of money to spend.
Okay. You mentioned the using satellite data for farming and things like that. What are some of the technology? I mean, you hear some people say, "Why are we spending all this money on space just to send a few astronauts up to have fun?" Obviously, that's wrong. But how do those of us who are going to stay on Earth, how does the space activity or the space technology or research helping everybody on the planet?
Yeah, so there are two segments here. There's the satellites, the payloads that are uncrewed that have automated systems that we use on a daily basis and have for decades. I already mentioned weather, GPS satellites, and similar, navigation, precision timing satellites that give us all kinds of data in terms of the exact precise times of things and the exact precise locations of things, which is used in all kinds of logistics, tracking, commerce, banking, all over the place. And then we see a lot of these constellations popping up. You've heard of Starlink, I'm sure, but there's several others. So SpaceX Starlink is in the lead for sure, and they are providing internet connectivity around the world. You might have noticed last year with the war in Ukraine how much that was needed, where they had cut off and they got satellite receivers down from SpaceX and were able to receive the Starlink communications and be connected to the rest of the world, despite the fact that there was a war going on. Also, from the war, you might have remembered that we saw a lot more imagery. So the Department of Defense, National Security uses space quite a bit. And it's not all just for, war. It's also for protection. It's for monitoring. It's you can catch illegal fishing or actually slave ships, which still exist. You can catch that kind of stuff. Illegal looting of archaeological sites or rainforest deforestation. All of that is monitored by these kinds of satellites. So there's so much going on that people just aren't aware. But bringing it down to everyday life, right? I mean, we all check our weather, and there's a joke. I think it's based on reality where somebody in Congress in a hearing asked, "Why do we need weather satellites when we could just turn on the Weather Channel?" Not realizing that the Weather Channel is how we get our, it's from those satellites that we get our data. But not only that, like, the entire field of environmental science became reality because of the Earth observation satellites and the weather satellites and the climate monitoring satellites that we have had for decades. So all of that ties together. Now, the other segment is humans, right? You might see was it 2 years ago now, year and a half ago, the billionaire space race, Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson going up on their own rockets to suborbital space, those suborbital hops and coming back down. And that might have seemed like a waste to some people, but they didn't realize there was actually science being done on those missions. So the very first human-tended science experiment was done on that Virgin Galactic flight, looking at plant science and how are plants affected by microgravity conditions. There is is real science going on. I'm part of a organization that hosts a conference called the Next Generation Suborbital Researchers Conference. And that
Okay.
specifically focuses on suborbital research and all the technology and all the innovation that can come from just quick 5-minute hops to space, not even counting the orbital science, which has been
Mm.
done since the very first space station. And we've had people on board being able to do these science experiments. Humans in the loop can really make a difference. So it's not just like human physiology, human medicine, humans as a guinea pig, but it's also humans actually doing the science. And it's really important when you send up real scientists, like people who have degrees in science, who can actually do their work in space, like CRISPR, that biology genetics experiment that was
Yeah.
sent up, a real biologist worked on that, was able to do real science that way up on the space station. You're seeing a lot more of that now. Space station is a laboratory. It's got
Mhm.
not only a US national laboratory, it's got a Japanese laboratory, and it's got Russian segment laboratories. And then there's also a Chinese space station up, which is also a laboratory. So there's 2 space stations right now. Both of them are doing excellent science.
Okay. Wow, that's great. I know one of the areas, in addition to helping businesses with space activities or transitioning into space, you help individuals who are looking for a job or either a different job in space or they've always dreamed of working with space. And there's this belief with some people that, well, that it's just for people who have STEM degrees, science, technology, engineering, math. Um, is that right?
Nope, nope, not right at all. And I
Okay.
was told that when I was a student,
Really?
but it is incorrect. The space industry is what we call the meaning of all the industries that you work in space, like use space hardware or use space data. And that is so many industries, you wouldn't even believe it. So we already talked about like agriculture and real estate and, there's insurance. I mean, like there's just so many sectors that use space. So chances are a lot of your listeners already involved in technology, already using space data, whether they realize it or not. But not only that, you can be more intentional. If you are in any field at all, any background at all, you can work in space because those skills are transferable and all businesses operate the same. A space business is the same as any other business, especially a
Yeah.
tech business. And so you see the need for business people, for finance, for economists, for communications, for graphic design and art, for all different kinds of people. I just hired a salesperson. I hired writers. I mean, anybody and everybody who can have any role in any business can work in space. So pretty much anybody.
Okay. That's exciting. It opens the door to so many different people, so many different roles. And I guess, yeah, it's a company and they need, I guess, non-tech people, or at least not traditionally tech to run the companies too. That's fun. What You're the author of a couple of books. The most recent one is titled Becoming Off-Worldly. What's it about? And what was the motivation to write that book?
I write the books that I would want to read. And that book in
Perfect.
particular is how do you prepare to go to space? So if you're not, superhuman, if you're not the right stuff kind of astronaut from the 1960s, and you still want to go to space, how do you prepare? How do you prepare holistically? So that is physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And then not only that, but you've done all this preparation. You know, government astronauts, they train for years, but
Hmm.
government astronauts still get surprised. So the first half of the book is interviews with various government astronauts and non-government astronauts. So NASA, ESA, JAXA, but also 2 private individuals who paid their own way to go to the space station. And I asked them what surprised them about space, what they could not prepare for that was just shocking to them. And then the second half of the book was interviewing people who were ticket holders, not just people like maybe you and me, or I'm going to speak for myself, not just people like me who want to go to space, but people who actually purchased a ticket. In fact, 4 people I interviewed actually flew to space by the time the book was published. So they're,
Wow.
they're really, truly going. And I asked them why and what are they doing to prepare? And I got a variety of really great answers about how they're preparing, as well as interviewing people who are involved in space flight training and how you can, with all the things you might want to think about before you get a chance to fly, whether you're going for 5 minutes to suborbital space or whether you're going for a week on the space station or beyond. I mean,
Yeah.
there's just a lot to think about. It's not just, the physical preparation that you might think of. It's all of the planning, all of the mental, emotional, spiritual, and logistical planning that goes into it. And I wrote it for
Mhm.
people like you or at least for me, who want to go to space, who, just don't know how exactly they're going to do it, how or when they're going to do it.
Hmm.
And then the ending of that book actually talked about how we need to be more inclusive about the people who are able to go to space. So I'm actually writing a third book about people with disabilities going to space, because that is
Oh,
becoming a real focus of how do
mhm.
we include the rest of the human population that has been historically, not included, not for any reason that is tangible, but for the fact that we don't design accessibility into our hardware and procedures, just
Hmm.
in general. And that translates also into space. Like, we just don't think about it. And so we exclude people who otherwise would be excellent people to be in space. And why shouldn't they? So really trying to include the rest of human population into the category of people who might want to fly to space someday.
Okay, that's great. We'll definitely keep watch for the new book. Going back to your most recent published book, you mentioned there are some surprises. Can you share one or two without giving away all the secrets in the
Yes.
book?
So the one that surprised me the most
Mhm.
was the view of Earth. Almost universally, astronauts
Mm.
describe the fact that they just could not imagine the view of Earth being that beautiful. We've seen images, we've seen videos, but apparently seeing it with your own eyes makes that much of a difference. But not only that, we are trained to see borders. If you look at a globe, an atlas, you can see the outlines of states or countries.
Sure.
And even people who are trained not to do that, it still takes them time to realize that Earth is not divided the way that we humans divide it. It's actually just land masses on a water world, and really trying to
Mhm.
observe the fact that we are all interconnected, that human activity on one part of the globe actually affects human activity on another part of the globe. You can see those air currents. You can see the way that the human activity really changes the landscape, and how we're all very interconnected. And not only that, but there's this sliver of blue that protects us from the darkness and death of Earth. I included a quote from William Shatner, who flew when he was 90 years old on a Blue Origin flight that was about 5 minutes in space. And he was profoundly changed because
Yeah.
the perception of our atmosphere being this thin blue line that is so fragile and so small, that protects all of life on Earth, that we really need to protect our planet. And
Yeah.
people tend to come back with some kind of changed perspective of whether it's environmentalism, whether it is they need to visit all the places they saw from above, they want to physically go there,
Yeah.
or make some other way they want to appreciate the fact that we're all interconnected on this one planet.
Hmm. Interesting. I remember seeing a video of William Shatner shortly after they came back and landed, and it was clear how emotional he was and what an impact it was. I mean, as much as he's seen in his 90 years, that was still uh, a big deal. So it's cool. What's the biggest in your mind? What are some of the biggest challenges kind of facing the space industry today that we need to be, or that they need to be working through in the next few years?
Space debris is one of the biggest
Mm.
ones. Just like we trash our planet, we also trash the environment around our planet. And this has been going on for decades. And it is just simple carelessness. The fact that we just didn't realize that the material that we were leaving up there was going to come back and bite us. It was going to be problematic eventually. And
Yeah.
now we've gotten to the point where, yeah, it truly is something we need to address. So this is things like spent rocket boosters. When a rocket launches, it has multiple stages, and sometimes they just leave those stages in orbit. And sometimes eventually those stages, they come crashing back down. There
Yeah.
is a part of the ocean that we usually try to direct these large objects towards, so that it doesn't land on somebody's house. But for other types of space trash, it can come down uncontrolled. And we typically see
Yeah.
this with Chinese rocket boosters, honestly. But there are SpaceX rocket boosters and others that we just leave up there. And some of these have been up there for decades, not the SpaceX ones, but just we weren't thinking about it. So there's old
Yeah.
Russian ones, there's old American ones that have just been up there for so long. And then there's the smaller pieces, any kind of flecks of paint, any kind of tools, any kind of pieces of metal. And then there's the worst kind, which is the ones that we purposely created. There are clouds of debris out there because we blow up our own satellites. The United States, Russia, China, and India have all blown up our own satellites on purpose. We call this kinetic anti satellite testing, where we want to prove that we can. We want to prove that we've got the technology to do damage to other people's satellites. Now,
Mm.
just last year, we in the United States actually issued a moratorium where we're not going to do this anymore. And there are some countries that have joined this moratorium, but none of the countries that have previously conducted these ASAT tests have actually agreed to not do them again,
Mm.
except for the United States. So this is something that is meant to protect our orbital environment, because if it gets too crowded, if it gets too dangerous to launch or operate in space, then that affects the entire globe.
Sure.
Every person, every country, every company that wants to operate in space, it can't do so if it's too crowded, that you can't operate. There's going to be collisions and more collisions, and that's called the Kessler syndrome, if this domino effect of collisions. Now, there's a good side to this, which is there are companies innovating to clean up the space trash.
Hmm.
So you do have space debris removal companies. You also have satellite servicing. So this is a new thing that is really coming online, in the past couple of years, where there is a means of either attaching to a satellite that wasn't meant to be attached to, or attaching to a satellite that has some kind of connector, some kind of bus that is meant to be serviced, and either refueling it, boosting it to a higher orbit, boosting it to a lower orbit so it can deorbit quicker. The
Okay.
FCC here in the United States actually has a new rule in place where you have to deorbit your dead satellites more quickly so that it can burn up in Earth's atmosphere. I mean, there's different ways to address this, and we are getting more innovative in how we do it, but there's a lot left to do.
Okay. Yeah, something to address soon since there's more and more objects going up and into space. So it's love talking with you today. Lots of great information. What's ahead for you in, let's say, the next year or two? What are your big plans or your big goals?
I am growing my company Astralytical. I
Mhm.
recently spun off the space career coaching side from the consulting side. So if you go to lauraforczyk.com, you can see the different offerings I have for space career coaching. If you're interested in getting into the space industry, or if you're already in the space industry and you're looking to grow or change, I also offer executive coaching for space leaders. And so that part of my business is growing tremendously. And then on the consulting side, I've had a few client wins recently, which has really been exciting to see. And we are growing that side with various outputs that we're doing, reports, writing, and hopefully later this year, do a lot more of the business development side to get more clientele coming in the door. So I'm really excited about the clients that we had last year, where we had some wins. And even early this year, we had some wins. A client had his second NASA grant win. Another client this
Cool.
year, actually, that we had last year, we helped them to get a client for Spaceport that was just recently
Mm.
approved. So a new
Cool.
spaceport coming online around the world. I mean, these little things that we can do that, have effects down the line that really change how we operate in space globally. It's really exciting to see.
Okay. Sounds like you have a busy year coming up.
I hope
That's
so.
great. Do you? I know obviously your books are some of your favorites. Do you have a favorite book that you've read recently, either fiction or nonfiction?
My favorite book ever is Dune by Frank Herbert. So I've
Okay.
read that many times. I'm really excited about the second half of the new Dune movie coming out. It's always fun to see the remakes and to see how they reimagine my favorite book. I
Yeah.
just finished the first book of the Expanse series. So I loved the TV series The Expanse, and there is a whole book series that
Oh,
apparently
okay.
goes even farther into the plot than the TV series did. And I just finished the first book, and it was as amazing as I remembered the show to be. So I'm really
Okay.
excited to dive into the rest of the series.
Well, cool. I've read Dune. That one takes a little while, but that was good. I'll have to check out The Expanse. I'm not familiar with that. So, and I'll put show notes to both those books as well as your website. Put links there in the show notes so that listeners can find that easily. Um, so I just love talking with you. I'm glad I know with your busy schedule. I'm glad you took some time to talk with me and share your knowledge and share your experience and all the exciting things that are happening. If people want to get in touch with you, or if they have questions, what's the best way for them to reach out?
You can go to the websites lauraforsick.com or astralytical.com. I'm also active on social media on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So you can reach out in any of those places. I'm happy to connect.
Okay. And I will get links to those to Astralytical as well as your LinkedIn profile and some of the other social media links so people can find you and follow up or ask questions or just watch your all the fun stuff you're involved in. So thanks again, Laura. I love talking with you today, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me on.